of the wrong sort of debt, and in particular the sort of debt which is fundamentally financing a competition for the ownership of an already existing irreproducible asset, which is land. Because the problem, and this very much relates to the sort of Hyman-Minsky view of the world, is that where you have an asset, the price of which is endogenously determined by the amount of credit which is pursuing it, you can have these credit and asset price cycles. So my fundamental assertion is that real economy leverage can be a problem because a free financial system itself will create too much real economy leverage, focus not on new investment that creates new corporate cash flows to pay it back, but fundamentally by forms of asset speculation. And the problem when you get to the other side of that cycle and the pop of the asset prices and the thing goes into reverse is precisely the point that Joe mentioned, but you can have it within an economy. The asymmetry between net creditors and net debtors can exist within an economy. Once you have a fall in assets and net worth, you have a group of people who perceive themselves to be over-leveraged, who are focused on deleveraging their positions, who are saving like mad, cutting investment and cutting consumption, and there is no natural process whereby the people who lent them the money feel the need to increase their consumption or investment in an offsetting fashion. So the fundamental point about the asymmetry between savers and investors, which we tend to think of in the international terms, because that's how Keynes thought about it in his whole background of the International Currency Union, that can exist within an economy, and that is a fundamental problem. So my fundamental statement about the closed economy is one thing that can go wrong is too much leverage focused on real estate asset appreciation rather than new investment, and that when you get to the other side of the bursting of that bubble, you will have a debt overhang problem which will put you in a very difficult macro position. The other thing that can go wrong domestically is not the increase in real economy leverage, but the proliferation of the size of the financial system on itself, or that intra-financial system complexity, which is, as it were, the gross size of the financial system growing massively more than the net size. So my fundamental proposition when I then turn to international flows is to understand them as a subset of this fundamental problem about too much real economy leverage and too much gross financial system intensity. The too much real economy leverage equivalent is the point about the net capital flows. And just as debt within an economy could be funding over-investment cycles or over-consumption or existing asset price bubbles quite as much as good productive investment, so does net capital flows. The net capital flow issue is fundamentally an issue about what it finances. And the fundamental problem with those huge capital flows from China and into America is that they were not financing anything remotely equivalent to Argentinian railways in 1905. They were funding some combination of unsustainable consumption among low-income people or a circular asset price bubble, both in the price of new housing and of existing housing. So fundamentally, the trickiness on net capital flows is they tend to finance sometimes new real estate construction booms. That was to a degree the story in Spain, Ireland, and US. They finance an existing asset price cycle. The UK had a credit and asset price cycle really without a new investment cycle, or they finance unsustainable consumption. And because they do all that, they also can create, when the thing pops, a debt overhang. But that debt overhang is more problematic because it involves an international element. The debt overhang, the asymmetry between the savers and the borrowers is between Chinese savers and US borrowers. And that's a much more difficult thing for anybody to manage their way out of than a purely domestic one. So I want to position net capital flows in the form that they have taken in the modern world as being a subset of the problem of over-expansive debt flows, but a particularly problematic one. And equally, gross capital flows, I think we can think of, particularly when they take debt form, as a particular manifestation at global and international level of intra-financial intensity, which also can apply and can cause problems at domestic levels. So that's my analysis. I've sort of run through it very quickly, and I hope it's simply forced you to read the paper I've put forward as a set of propositions. But what do I then say about policies? Well, I'm not going to talk about why I don't think it's IMF official liquidity facilities, but I'm willing to answer that question, nor the reserve role of the dollar. In relation to net capital flows, I think we have to go back to why did we have these huge net capital flows? And I think the interpretation has to be things to do both with the structural characteristics of countries like China creating an excess of savings, or Germany of Japan, and America and Spain a structural deficits on the other side. I love a phrase from Michael Pettis's book, which is called The Inanity of Moralizing. We shouldn't get too worked up as who's to blame between the net savers and the net deficit. We have to find some way, of a simultaneous way, of getting round those imbalances, because unless we do, we will continue to get a whole load of net capital flows of this character, which will create problems. As for gross capital flows, I think the key insights here are in Helen Ray's paper at Jackson Hole, which the fundamental reason why these are worrying is that they interface with the domestic credit cycle and the domestic asset cycle, which is where the two parts of my analysis come together. Which is why I think it is highly likely, therefore, that the most appropriate policy responses are precisely the ones which exist at the nexus between the international and domestic, and they are likely to buoy the macroprudential tools. One final one that I have added, however, to those which are in Helen's paper and others is, I do think we should think carefully about the interface between macroprudential tools addressing the international and domestic credit cycles and the legal structure of major global banking groups. And fundamentally, I think wherever they provide significant amounts of credit domestically, they should operate as subsidiaries, because that gives a mechanism for the local authorities, through supervision and rules, to control their contribution to the local domestic cycle. Now, I know when I say that I am going to get accused by my dear colleagues in the banking industry of contributing to the fragmentation of the international capital markets, or the fragmentation of the international financial system. And my answer to that is, you don't fragment it in its real useful long-term senses. There's nothing about requiring subsidiarization of branches which is stopping foreign direct investment, i.e. HSBC putting more equity capital into India, where I think in the domestic environment it should be able to compete freely with local banks, provided it is doing in a highly capitalized, well-equitized subsidiary form. You're not getting in the way of the transfer of equity capital. You're not getting in the way of the transfer of long-term debt capital. You are getting in the way by demanding subsidiarization of the flexible backwards and forwards use of pools of global liquidity for a set of gross short-term debt flows backwards and forwards, which I think pretty much all of the analysis suggests are of no particular value, which is why I put out a press release on this speech deliberately to stir things up back in the UK, which is called "Don't Worry About the Balkanization of the Global Financial System." That's my thoughts. Thank you.